Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Insight lecture, which might be the last one for some time. We don't know yet. My name is Daniel Siemens. I'm Professor of European History here in Newcastle, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you, and of course to welcome our distinguished guest today, Brendan Sims from the University of Cambridge. Just really a few words of introduction. Obviously, some people might be staying at home for coronavirus. Others might not come because of the industrial action, which is now going on in the fourth week. And just want to remind you that one of the slogans of the ongoing strike action is "We are the university." And it's about making sure that we are not only service providers to customers, formerly called students, but that we have the university as a place for scholarly exchange, for learning and dialogue. And I hope that this evening will be very much in the spirit of dialogue, and we look forward to Brendan's lecture, and afterwards we'll have 15-20 minutes time for questions from you. So if anything pops up, please make a note and keep it for the end. Brendan is Professor of History of International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies in Cambridge, and he's also the President of the Henry Jackson Society, which is a conservative think tank that advocates political values and a robust foreign policy. More broadly, for our purpose in any case, is that he's the author of many important books. Most recently, and some of you might have seen it outside, the new biography of Adolf Hitler that deviates quite substantially from the many other autobiographies of Hitler that we already have, by shifting the focus more towards the relationship that the Nazis had, or the hate that they had for the Anglo-American war. That is Brendan's main argument. If you're interested in that, not talk about it probably now, but in my book, and I assume you'd be happy to sign it afterwards if people so wish. However, today not the Nazis, but British and Britain relationship with Europe in long-term perspective. We actually started this planning more than a year ago, and it was initially under the title 1 year after Brexit. Historical perspective, that was the idea, right? After the heat of the day, step back and think about the long-term implications. And obviously this didn't happen. So Brendan was not the point. Brendan was perfectly happy to come, quickly agreed, but then Brexit had some delay, and we had to change the title a few times internally, and this is now what you see. Brendan is one of the most prolific and probably also well-known authors have repeatedly written on this topic, and one of the, to show this to you, this is one of the books that he did before the Hitler book, 2016. This came out, Britain's Europe, and he argued in this book that the history of England and later Britain was primarily a continental story. The destiny of Britain was determined by relations with the rest of Europe rather than the wider world. It would be an overstatement to say that Brendan is a fan of the European Union, at least in the present state, but he has always argued that Britain cannot really separate from developments in the continent, and that it should rather be Britain's role to help Europe in solving continental problems, as you will probably explain in your lecture. This has happened over the last 100 years a couple of times. When you wrote it in 2016, obviously we've moved ahead 4 years, and I'm curious to learn what you now think about British willingness to help Europe out. But that might be one of the questions we can discuss in the end. First of all, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming, Brendan. We really look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel Siemens, for the introduction. I'm very grateful to the University of Newcastle for inviting me. It's a great honor. My topic, as you've heard, is Perspectives Beyond Brexit. Britain, Europe, historical perspectives beyond Brexit. And perhaps I should say in advance what this lecture therefore is not. It's not about inside baseball at Westminster on Brexit. It's not about the rights and wrongs of Brexit or the 2016 referendum debate. It's not even about Britain's relationship with Europe after it joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Rather, it's about what I would call the deep history of Brexit and where it might be heading. So quite a lot on the deep history, a certain amount looking forward, but a sort of a hole in the middle concerning all the stuff that you've probably heard quite a lot about, but maybe too much in the meantime. And this is offered in the spirit of Winston Churchill, who once said, the further we look back, the longer we can see forward. And I say this not to make concrete predictions, it's always fatal for an historian, but to offer what I hope is a more profound understanding. And the core of my argument is that the United Kingdom is, and certainly was, an exceptional actor in Europe. Not just in the sense that all European states are different, but differently different. And that's really the nub of the book that Daniel Siemens mentioned, Britain's Europe, 1,000 Years of Conflict and Cooperation, where I argue, indeed, as he says, that Britain has been shaped by Europe, but is also quite distinct. And that's an argument I want to elaborate in this lecture, and then derive from that some suggestions about where we might be going for the future. So there are three parts to the lecture. The first will be a survey of Britain's relationship with Europe historically, then a brief contrast with the history of mainland Europe, and then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on what all this might mean for today. So turning now to what one might call the European problem in British history. Well, Europe has really always been the main threat to England and then later Britain, the United Kingdom, from the 15th century to the 21st century. And I'm going to say England, United Kingdom, so on, fairly interchangeably. I'm aware at a certain point it becomes United Kingdom. We'll talk about that. But as an Irishman, I hope you'll allow me a certain leeway in these matters. So, why is it the main threat? As Churchill said, this is just before the First World War, a time when Britain was really at its most outward-looking in some ways, a global empire. Churchill says, quote, Europe is where the weather comes from. And that has always been the case. We have to think of English and later British history as relationship with Europe as a series of ever-extending circles. So if we just gallop briefly through these maps, which are in my book, you can see that we're talking about essentially a cross-channel empire in the Middle Ages, with northern France actually more important, certainly than Ireland or Scotland, and maybe even northern England. You have the empire of Henry V, so this is really an England which is focused on the narrow sea. Then you have the 16th century, where you then have a extended interest into the Low Countries, which is the jumping off point into England. Then you have the 17th century, where you've got huge preoccupation with the 30 Years' War. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then by the 18th century, you're talking about the European balance of power as a whole. I'll come back to that later on as well. So by the 18th century, it was clear that Britain saw itself as taking on, basically, to balance the European hegemony. Why, I'll come to in a minute. But you have the clash against the universal monarchy alleged of Philip II of Spain, later of Louis XIV of France in the 17th century, early 18th century. Then, of course, under Napoleon against the continental system, in the First World War against the Mittel Europa conceptions of the Kaiserreich, and then, of course, the Fortress Europe of Adolf Hitler. And this strategic threat, which in many cases is so clear, you all know that from your school history, what you've acquired since, that's also overlaid by a strong ideological component. So from the Reformation, from the 1530s onwards, in this country we have, if you like, the first Brexit, which is the separation of the Church of England from the Catholic Church. And there you've got a sense then of Protestantism in England requiring the defence of Protestantism in the rest of Europe. In the 17th and 18th century, you have the clash between parliamentary freedoms in this country and continental absolutism. In the 19th century, between liberalism and autocracy. That's a big theme, for example, during the Crimean War against the Tsarist Empire. And then, of course, in the 20th century, against the various forms of continental tyranny, Nazism, communism, and so on. My point, this very quick gallop, is to say that the nature of security, in a way, it's the same. It's basically, what's being argued in this country is that first the defence of Protestantism, then the defence of parliamentary liberties, then the defence of liberalism, then the defence of democracy in Britain, requires its defence in some way in Europe or in parts of Europe. So you can never really cut yourself off from the rest of Europe. So England, in other words, could not be defended just in the home islands. Because if you had a continental hegemon who was established on the other side of the channel, he could get to southern England. That's been a sort of constant in English strategic and later British strategic doctrine. And it's for that reason that Britain has been central to every European settlement over the past 300 years. So take, for example, the Treaty of Utrecht. So this is the 18th century map. Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 brings to an end the wars against Louis XIV and his alleged schemes of universal monarchy in Europe, taking over all of Europe and suppressing British parliamentary liberties, not so alleged, perhaps. What Britain does, it erects a barrier in the Low Countries to keep the French out, with fortresses manned by the Dutch, backed up by the British. And as you can see here, from all these figures and battles, you can see British troops go quite deep into Europe in defence of that continental balance. So in the 18th century, you cannot really conceive of Europe without that central British role. Then in the 19th century, post the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, the Vienna settlement, you actually have a British zone of occupation in northern France. Britain absolutely central to the defeat of Napoleon and bringing about the Vienna settlement. In the First World War, as you'll know extremely well, Britain absolutely decisive in the battle against Germany, also a zone of occupation, small one there, in Germany after the First World War. Likewise, in the Second World War, Britain less important, but still pretty significant in resisting Nazism, as you all know. And after the Second World War, a pretty large British zone of occupation in Germany. Britain not involved in the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957-58, but centrally involved in the establishment of NATO, of course, in 1949. So again, absolutely central to the European order from 1973 until 2016, part of both ordering systems, both the European Union and NATO. And the characteristics of NATO today, with eastward enlargement very much supported by Britain after some initial hesitation, and eastward enlargement of the European Union, again, very much supported by Britain. So why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you all this because what it shows is that Britain has always been an ordering power in Europe. It has always been one of the orderers, not one of the ordered. There isn't really any other European country of whom you could tell the same narrative over hundreds of years. There simply isn't. It is today, along with the United States, which is the majority shareholder, one of two freeholder powers in Europe. And how you calibrate the British stake is a matter of opinion, whether it's 10% or 15% or whatever. But the major shareholders in Europe, in my opinion, to elaborate that in discussion, are United Kingdom minority shareholder and the United States the majority shareholder. The rest of Europe are, by my categorization, tenants. They could buy out the freeholders if they want, but at the moment they are tenants of the European system. So that's the grand strategy. Let me now turn to the political dimension. Because not only is Europe central to the English and then British grand strategy, for the reasons I've given, but Europe is also pretty central to domestic politics in this country over hundreds of years. So in the 17th century, for example, the question of whether or not to intervene in the 30 Years' War is central to the argument between king and parliament, which leads to the English Civil War. Why? Because the parliamentarians argued that only the defense of the Protestant cause in Germany, which would prevent Spain from ultimately overrunning the Low Countries, putting down the Dutch revolt, which would then give them a jumping off point against England, only that will secure the home island. And the king basically disagrees. That's the original root of the dispute, which then becomes a much larger one. And so it centers essentially around the future of the Palatinate. And when Cromwell wins eventually, the first thing he does is to send an army to continental Europe to defeat the Spaniards, which he does, and walks away with the port of Dunkirk for a while. Then in the 18th century, the fundamental division is between Whigs and Tories. Very crudely, Tories believe that Britain's identity is colonial and commercial overseas, shouldn't be involved in Europe. The Whigs believe the opposite. The Whigs are, if you like, the descendants of the parliamentarians in that respect. They believe that only by maintaining the European balance of power will you be able to secure Britain. And while the empire is important, the empire should be subjugated to, or subordinate rather, to the maintaining of the European balance of power. And so you've got a clash in the 18th century between continental interventionists, broadly speaking Whigs, and blue water navalists, broadly speaking Tories. And of course you'll see immediately that this is actually the divide that runs all the way through to the present day. Much of the rhetoric you see today around Europe, you can read in very similar form in 18th century pamphlets. If you're interested in that, it's in one chapter here, but if you really want to overdose on it, you can read it in my book, Three Victories and the Defeat, which is about the 18th century, where you have that really to your heart's content. Then if you move on towards the end of the 18th century, again, the fundamental debate in this country is between Burke and Fox. Do you or do you not live with the French Revolution? Do you or do you not intervene in mainland Europe to suppress the expansionist power of France and the exporting revolution? And the answer to that, of course, is one. That argument is won by Burke, because it becomes clear that this country cannot survive if you have on the other side of the channel a power like revolution in France, which is exporting its ideology, but more importantly, is expansionist into the bargain. And the argument then during the Napoleonic period is the one between should we pursue a maritime policy, which is Dundas, a place who says, Grenville, who say, no, we must send armies to the continent until eventually we win. Again, that argument is won by the continentals. And you can pursue this debate all the way through the 19th century. In the 1930s, as you know well, the central question in the late 30s is appeasement. Then in the 90s, EU Maastricht debate, and of course that over the last 5 years or so, Europe is central to British domestic politics. That's something that's so obvious, I don't even need to elaborate. So Europe is central. Europe is crucial to the political life of this country. But not only that, the European dimension actually shapes the policy of the United Kingdom itself. The formation of Great Britain, later United Kingdom, and Ireland, that is a product of the European state system. Why? Because, historically, a number of reasons. First of all, the Scots are broke, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is that Scotland has, of course, for hundreds of years been an independent state, in permanent rivalry, more or less, with the English, used as the backdoor into England by France and by Spain. And so what you have in the late 17th, early 18th century is a convergence of the fact that many Scottish elites begin to believe that the main enemy is no longer England, but is the France of Louis XIV, which is counter-Reformation Catholicism and its attack on parliamentary liberties, they believe. And on the English side, they want to close the back door and want to rally the whole forces of England and Scotland on the European scene against Louis XIV. And simply having a regnal union, a union of crowns, as had existed since 1603, is not enough. The argument was we have to have a full parliamentary union, because that is the only way that you can bring these two polities, England and Scotland, together. And that's what happens in 1707, primarily in order to create one unit active on the European scene. So, I would say Europe made us. No European state system, no United Kingdom. The United Kingdom makes no sense originally outside of its European context. And what this union did in 1707, it created a system for the infliction and the absorption of pain. That's really what the United Kingdom is. It is an entity which is able to absorb reverses and to deal out punishment. And it's worth pausing for a minute to consider the significance of the Act of Union in 1707. The English and the Scottish states, which have existed since hundreds of years with their own parliaments, ended that year. In 1707, two separate polities agreed to form, a year later, just one union. So a union was an event, it was not a process. Important point I'll come back to in a minute. Union in this country, this state, is an event, not a process. It made the English today the largest nation in Europe without its own nation state. Not a point that's often recognized. I'll come back to that later. And it created a new identity, Britishness, which had been incipient before then, but the Britishness essentially followed 1707 rather than 1707 being a product of Britishness. It also created a structure which is distinctive in Europe. A parliamentary union, a union of debt, and a union of defence, which mobilised the population of these islands better than elsewhere in Europe, certainly better than in France, and therefore helped to make the United Kingdom very important historically in Europe, and this shape of Europe, which I described at the beginning of my lecture. And in some ways, it still is the most important European power today. Fifth largest economy in the world, a nuclear power, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and of course an unbroken, as yet, political tradition. So let me move now to the second and shorter part, middle part of my lecture, which is the contrast with mainland Europe. This is essentially the story of the German question and the European problem, or if you prefer, the European question and the German problem, basically the same thing. I talked about this at length in my book, Europe, the Struggle for Supremacy, which essentially argues that Germany is the fulcrum of European history by virtue of its location, obviously, at the heart of Europe, by virtue of its focus strategically for most of the European actors, by virtue of its size, and by virtue of its potential strength economically and militarily. So, for many hundreds of years, the Germans were often objects of European politics. In the 30 Years' War, for example, which I mentioned earlier, Germany was essentially marched over and contested, and the Germans were victims. Also, in the time of Louis XIV, late 17th, early 18th century, likewise, in the period of the French Revolution and Napoleon. And in 1806, in fact, the German political commonwealth, this Holy Roman Empire, collapsed under the external assault from France. So the Germans experienced territorial losses, occupation, and humiliation. But when Germany united in 1870-71, when the Germans became subjects of the European order rather than really objects, in the case of Kaiser's Germany and later Hitler's Third Reich, the result was to reduce much of the rest of Europe to objects. Germans became subjects, much of the rest of Europe became objects. German power was too large to be accommodated in the system. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is the reason why we have the European Union. After the end of World War II, both Germans and other mainland Europeans were and felt themselves to be objects. They were part of the order. They were not orders. Their territory had been marched across by different powers, from the east by the Russians, of course, and from the west by the Anglo-Americans. By Anglo, I also include, of course, Canadians and others. More French Canadians, indeed, even approaching, just from the point of view of illustration. So, at the same time, you also have the Soviet threat post-1945, and you have the fear of what would happen if Germany would revive. So the European project is a project of double containment, to embed, keep down Germany, and to keep out and contain Russia. But it's also a project of double mobilization, to mobilize, if you can, the energies of Germany through the European structures, so that Germany would not simply be a wheel spinning in neutral that was locking into the greater European project. And this was very much supported by the United States and indeed by Winston Churchill in his famous Zurich speech of 1946, many of you will have heard of, where he praises the idea of mainland European Union. He doesn't think Britain's going to be part of it, but he thinks it's a good idea for mainland Europe. So the European project was designed to enable the Germans to become subjects without turning the rest of mainland Europe into objects. And indeed, over the past 60 years or so, the European project has made great strides. It's created the single market, it's created the common currency, it's created the Schengen travel area, it's attempting a common foreign and security policy. All this designed to diffuse European tensions, to embed Germany, and to mobilize the continent within the world. But this European project was a process, not an event. So it's unlike the United Kingdom, unlike the Anglo-Scottish Union, it's not a single moment of radical political and economic union. Instead, what we've seen until recently has been a gradual process of convergence, economic and political. And the idea is that this would then be crowned at some point in the future. It would almost imperceptibly end up in a full union. But there would be no moment as such. No crunch point like 1706, 1707, or like you had in the United States in the late 1780s. But this European Union remains, from my point of view, aggressively, an incomplete union. It has federal aims, so the euro is a federal project. The Schengen borderless zone is a federal project. And common foreign and security policy is a federal project. But we in what is left of the European Union, I have only an Irish passport, we have only given ourselves confederal instruments to fulfill these aims. We have no political union like the United Kingdom. So we have no joint economic government or overarching political structure. We have no common army and can't until we have a common policy. We have no common border defense, as we've seen. And Germany is not really embedded in a political union. It has remained a distinct state actor, with consequences in the euro crisis and the refugee crisis, which some people have been unhappy about. So to sum up the historical part of my argument, on the continent, by which I mean mainland Europe and European instability was the problem, and European union was the answer, or seems to be. In Britain, Europe was also the problem, but the United Kingdom was the answer. So if you contrast the UK and the mainland European experience, you would say that after 1945, there was a general sense that Germany was so large and the Soviet Union was so threatening that weak European states had to prove political sovereignty, which they didn't have anyway, to balance these threats. But nobody said after 1945 that the United Kingdom was so threatened that it needs to be contained by European federation, or that it was so weak that it required protection of the European Federation. And it would have been strange to argue that, because in 1945, British troops stood in most parts of the European, western part of the European continent, amidst the rubble of cities they leveled in Germany and elsewhere. So the idea that the United Kingdom required the protection of Europe at that point didn't make a great deal of sense. And possibly the Irish and possibly some Scots might think that the European Union is a device for retaining England. But most of mainland Europe, at least until comparatively recently, did not hold that view. So these are fundamentally different points of departure, is my point. So that's the history. What does it all mean for today? Well, I've argued that the UK has always been an ordering power in Europe, not a space to be ordered. It has been among the orderers, not one of the ordered. Over the past 40 years or so, it's done a substantial part of its ordering through the structures of the European Union. So the question I think we now have to ask ourselves, looking at this geopolitically, is, after Brexit, twofold. A, who will order the space of the United Kingdom after Brexit, the European Union or the United Kingdom? That was the fundamental point at issue between 2017 and December 2019. I'll come back to that in a minute. And assuming that the United Kingdom orders its own space, which now seems likely for the reasons I've given, in fact is now the case in some ways, or will be soon the case, most likely. How will the United Kingdom then exercise its ordering role in Europe if it still has one? Because of course it no longer has the structures of the European Union through which that can be articulated. Now, the answer of the European Union to these questions was pretty clear post-2016. It regards itself as the sole economic, political and legal ordering system on the European continent. That's its view, its ideology. And it consequently believes that by leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom has forfeited any right to participate in the political management of the continent. Now, if this were true, and for now this ordering claim is an assertion rather than a statement of fact, it would mark a radical breach with the pattern of the past 300 years, more than 300 years. So for that to happen, everything I've just described would have to be set aside. Of course, history does change, constellations change, but that would be a very radical shift. But in fact, the European Union's ordering claim went further than that. It not merely said that the United Kingdom would no longer have any role in the ordering of the continent, except through security, which I'll come back to in a minute. It also said that a neat separation of the United Kingdom from the European Union was impossible because of Northern Ireland. So to defend, in inverted commas, the single market, this required border controls from the European Union's point of view, which would damage the vital interests of a member state, namely the Irish Republic. And for this reason, as you'll all recall, the European Union demanded that the Irish border be sorted out according to its own interests. That is to say, it would have to stay within a customs union, which, by its very nature, in fact, violated the Act of Union with Ireland, or rather with the bit of Ireland that remains within the United Kingdom. In other words, there's actually no way of Brexit happening without this fundamental clash of ordering systems being resolved, even leaving aside Britain's role in Europe after Brexit. And the EU expectation, and that of many, was that the negotiation would follow a familiar playbook. Playbook that we saw in Ireland, which voted against the Nice Treaty in 2001, had to vote again and accepted it. Ireland voted against the Lisbon Treaty in 2008, was asked to vote again and accepted it. The Greeks said various things in various referenda, but then did as they were told. Surely the argument was the United Kingdom would recognise the futility of Brexit and vote again, and if they didn't, they would get a bad deal. And essentially this interpretation was accepted by the administration of Theresa May. And the result was the withdrawal agreement of 2018, designed as preparatory to the subsequent arrangement on trade and political relationship. I'm looking at this geopolitically, not on the economic and other merits of the deal. The contentious bits, as you will recall, related to the customs arrangements. The United Kingdom was to be part of the customs union until a new economic arrangement was negotiated. If the UK, however, was no longer part of the customs union, and if no satisfactory border arrangements could be found to avoid controls on the island of Ireland, then Northern Ireland would stay within the customs union and most of the single market. This is the so-called backstop. To avoid that happening, which would have divided the Union, the UK Union, Theresa May then said, well, we'll have an all-UK backstop. And what this meant, in geopolitical terms, was that the United Kingdom was locked into the customs union. It could exit only by leaving Northern Ireland behind. So the United Kingdom, in other words, would be part of a geo-economic system and a geo-legal system over which it had no voice. So this was, in my view, the negation of at least 300 years of history, with the UK now ordered, not ordering or co-ordering. At the same time, and this was the paradox, the UK was also ordering Europe through security. It was in fact protecting Europe more than any other European power through, in particular, the deterrence mission in Eastern Europe, especially here in the Baltic. And so you have a paradoxical interplay of two ordering systems. So had the May deal come into force, you would have had the paradoxical situation that Estonia, over here, would have had, along with Ireland, a bigger role in the running of the UK economy through the customs union and other systems than the UK would itself. At the same time, the United Kingdom will be doing more than any other European state to protect Estonia against the Russians. All this at the behest of the Irish Republic, which was not only doing less, but was doing nothing at all, because it wasn't even part of NATO. So this was in geopolitical terms, this was a very bizarre proposition. And so it's therefore not hard to see why the agreement was rejected. It simply didn't reflect the view the United Kingdom had of itself. Obviously not the leaders, for whom it negated the whole purpose of Brexit, turned the United Kingdom into an object in an important part of its national life, but also for Remainers, because you could be co-ordering by remaining within the European Union. So the May Agreement, as you all recall, had the worst of all worlds. So the May government fell, the Johnson administration came in, and we looked set in the autumn of 2019 for an epic clash of ordering systems. How was this going to be resolved? But in fact, that autumn, the European Union, or rather Dublin, blinked first in the Varadkar-Johnson deal. What had been the backstop became the front stop. Now, many of you may be under the impression, though I could be doing him injustice, that he simply accepted the backstop, having said he wouldn't. But in fact, he didn't. It is a front stop. In other words, the arrangements come in. Northern Ireland's part remains in the single market and the customs union from the beginning, not simply as a backstop. But there is a backdoor out. After 4 years, the Northern Ireland Assembly can vote to leave this arrangement. Why is that important? Because this is exactly the unionist veto that Dublin and Brussels had previously rejected. The previous withdrawal agreement was simply Europe saying to the United Kingdom, in effect, hand over Northern Ireland to our ordering system, or all of you stay in the ordering system. So in other words, Johnson had torn the heart out of the backstop, Brexit could go ahead, and at the end of the January that was, the United Kingdom formally left the European Union. Now, the future EU-UK relationship, of course, remains to be determined. And this will, of course, be a process, not an event. The relationship I described, this establishment of an ordering function, was also a process. It evolved over a long period of time. The negotiations, as we all know, are to be completed by the end of 2020. Many outcomes are possible, and some people have even spoken about no deal at the end of that round. But I think actually the outlines of the relationship are already clearer than they were before. First of all, I think we now know that the United Kingdom will order its own territory, legally and economically, and not the European Union. Certainly as regards England, Wales, and Scotland. And, as I said, the European Union has also accepted that Northern Ireland will or can leave the customs union if its elected representatives so wish. So the consent principle of Northern Ireland, which the original withdrawal agreement had set aside, has been re-established. Secondly, and this is a point I think that is not often realised, and is something that Michel Barnier greatly feared during the original negotiations, the nature of the Johnson-Varadkar deal is such as to increase the incentive on the European Union side to reach a non-punitive, comprehensive free trade deal. Why? Because failure to do so would create east-west barriers to trade in the United Kingdom. So the bigger the barriers between the European Union and the United Kingdom trade, the bigger the barrier that will run in the Irish Sea, the bigger the incentive for Northern Unions to say this is dividing the Union and to vote out. So this is a huge incentive, certainly for Dublin, to push for the best possible non-punitive deal, and the Europeans to let that happen. What is not yet clear is how the European Union will discharge its geopolitical ordering functions, if any, in the future. That is perhaps the most important long-term question, and it is striking that neither London nor Brussels have even begun to address it. So let me attempt in 2 or 3 minutes to suggest what that relationship might be, and it's absolutely vital that such an arrangement is found, because a hard or disorderly Brexit process in the second stage will have a huge economic cost that we all know about, but also a huge political cost. It could spill over into NATO, it could lead to the rise of British Trumpism, because why would, essentially Trump's argument has been, why do we defend the Europeans? They are exploiting us economically. Well, if you've got severe economic war between, ordering clash between EU and UK, why would the UK defend the eastern flank when it's being attacked economically? And the UK strategy at the moment is based on the assumption that everything to the west of this line is friendly. If to the west of this line is not friendly, the situation changes. The United Kingdom has been defended along the Elbe, in the Low Countries, and even in the extremists in the North Sea and the Narrow Sea. So that's a very important thing that mainland Europe has to get clear. Is it a friend or is it not a friend of the United Kingdom? And of course, conflict will distract from the larger tasks, China, Russia, and completing indeed the work of the Union. So how could we arrive at a solution for EU-UK? Well, I think it requires, first of all, what I would argue is the lacking intellectual clarity at the moment. We need to realize first that successful unions are an event, not a process. And this means, in effect, the EU needs to adopt the UK model, by which I mean it needs to achieve full political, economic, and military union. And that union can be either an asymmetric union, like the United Kingdom, where you've got a very large England and other nations grouped around it in that sense, or, so that could be Germany plus X, Y, Z, or it could be a symmetrical union like the United States, which would seem a better solution in view of the German question. But one way or the other, it needs to be a full political union. This is the only way of stabilizing the euro, of securing the borders, and deterring predators. The English, the Scots, and the Welsh, I would argue, already have their union. So in that sense, they don't need the full EU union. That will be the argument. Europeans need to understand that the basic unit here is the nation. In other words, not the UK and the Federal Republic of Germany, but the English and the Germans. So the English, and indeed the Scots, and the Welsh, and the Northern Irish no longer have their own nation states, while the Germans and other every other European nation, more or less, apart from the capitals, have their own nation state. So who is the nationalist here, you might ask? And the solution then, I think, is to establish a new European order, which in my view should have simply two unions. It should have the United Kingdom, and it should have the mainland union of Europe. These two unions should then be confederated for political, economic, and military co-management of the continent. Ideally, I think maybe the time for this is past, ideally I would have liked to have seen the United Kingdom exchange voting participatory membership of the customs union and the single market without free movement in return for its military contribution. But whatever the solution, it will have to be some form of co-management. So the question I leave you with, as my 40 minutes or so run out, is this. And really the question is, as it's always been about Europe, not about Britain. The most important dimension is mainland Europe. The English abolished their nation state more than 300 years ago to create Great Britain. My question is, when will the mainland Europeans finally do the same, wind up their nation states, and replace it with a full political union of mainland Europe? Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brendan, for this magnificent, very original and somehow also provocative presentation. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Obviously, I would like to ask questions myself, having a very different Central European perspective. I'll not do this because the floor is yours first. There are microphones around. Please.
Thank you very much for the talk, first of all. The historic relationship we talked about between the United Kingdom or England and Europe, traditionally that has been the United Kingdom against single states within Europe. But now the game has changed because it's the United Kingdom somewhat fragmented at the moment against a united Europe. All of the European nations are now united against us. So how does that change the dynamic going forward?
Thank you. So, of course, historically, the UK has found itself facing a united Europe in a number of occasions. Think of revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, for example. Think of 1940. So this is not completely unprecedented. That's the first point. The second point is that I think the UK is much less fragmented than you suggest. So this is a widespread view that you have, and I think the Europeans are much less united than it appears. So I don't see the United Kingdom fragmenting. In fact, I think Brexit has basically destroyed Scottish nationalism as a political project, because for there to be a separation of Scotland from England now could result in a hard border, north and south. And you would be leaving a United Kingdom which does work, for all its faults, for very uncharted territory in mainland Europe. You might have to have the euro. You might even become, if you're leading a rich union, relatively speaking, go into a union where you'd have to be paying in and so on and so forth. Really, the only context in which the Scottish Nationalist Project could be win-win for them was where both countries, north and south of the border, were part of the European Union. If they're not both part of the European Union, as we've seen over the backstop, it becomes very, very complicated. So there'll be a fair bit of surface turbulence, but I think that actually the European link has been the link that has created a permissive atmosphere for Scottish nationalism. There's no accident that it grows during a period of membership of the European Union, and I think it will begin to fall off once these realities are confronted. And so when you come to mainland Europe, the fragmentation is manifest. And so I don't think when you come to this negotiation, it's a completely different context. I mean, basically, Boris Johnson called the European bloc. They were absolutely clear you will not give the Unionists or the Assembly in Northern Ireland a veto. and were backed down. Because in order to push through their strategy, they would have to themselves have erected the border that they didn't want to have. It was going to be a European Union border. So that's why I would be more optimistic from the United Kingdom's point of view. I'm not, and it gives me no pleasure to say so. And I think what I think is most worrying is that the European Union, with all its problems, migration, the euro, the Russians, now coronavirus, of course, affects everybody, but mainland Europe worse than the United Kingdom, for reasons. Sorry?
Just wait a few days.
But it is, it's no accident that Trump has, issued his order for the Schengen area. You cannot seal off an area like that as effectively as you can the space of the United Kingdom or any other island or a space which is a defined political entity where you don't have rules that say the contrary. So, and it gives me no pleasure to say that. I would like the European Union and the United Kingdom to have a good and a rapid deal and then to concentrate on the things that unite us.
Okay, there are two more questions. Gentlemen over here and then over there.
I think it's very surprising that you're so optimistic about the future of the ordering strength of the United Kingdom, and in fact the strength of the United Kingdom, given that it was well into the 60s, the Scottish vote to stay in the EU, and all the signs are that in Northern Ireland that the movement is away from the United Kingdom in towards a united Ireland. I'd have thought that one of the consequences of the 2016 vote, more than anything, was that the fragmentation of the British Isles, which I don't particularly welcome, but I'm very surprised that you think that somehow this is a strengthening influence. It's a very odd perspective, I think.
Yeah, maybe we can take another question. Kai, sure, you're next.
Yeah, just to follow on from this comment. My sense was equally what you called the front stop, so being able to leave the customs union. The likelihood of that would possibly be, if you say so, or I would have thought that unification of Northern and the Republic of Ireland would actually also be on the cards equally. So that's the point I would make. And the other question I have is really also with reference to the UK as a kind of ordering power. So it actually boils down to having nuclear weapons. Is that what you basically, that's the main sort of card that the UK can actually play? Now, is that something that you foresee to be there forever? Let's assume that NATO falls apart. Let's assume that there's not going to be perhaps US support for UK nuclear weapons. So again, I'm not so sure whether we need to be optimistic about this.
Okay, thank you. So I've already given part of my answer on Scotland, just to elaborate on it. That actually the figures on independence haven't really shifted very much since 2014. So obviously it remains to be seen for the reasons I've given. I think that if you're against it, there's a double unionist majority in Scotland, as there is in Northern Ireland. Scots vote as a majority want to remain part of the United Kingdom and the European Union. It's my opinion that the majority for staying in the United Kingdom, even if it means leaving the European Union, is larger. And so far the polling seems to suggest that, and I think as it comes closer, it will become even starker, particularly if there's the turbulence. So if the European Union wants to encourage Scottish nationalism, it should give the United Kingdom the best possible trade deal so as to reduce potential difficulties at the border. Because otherwise there will be a hard border, north and south. And that would be, I think, the final deal breaker for Scotland. As regards Northern Ireland, it's the same story. It's a double majority for the Union. The notion that Northern Protestants would now more like, there is a certain kind of soft unionism, you're absolutely right, which being irritated with the outcome, because there's no upside to Ireland in Brexit whatsoever. It's a complete hindrance. That's what happens when you leave a larger entity. I mean, my family was from Donegal. One day they woke up, they lived in one country, which was then the Irish Free State in Lifford, and the family firm was in Strabane on the other side. That's, now Ireland can, that's what leaving a larger union brings consequences, absolutely. Does it mean that now these soft unionists will vote for unity with the Irish Republic? I never thought so. And if you think of what happened in the Irish election, certainly not with the huge growth of Sinn Féin, which has completely destroyed the Irish Republic's narrative of a country which has gone beyond nationalism, has left all of this behind, with the scenes of, IRA, people cheering up the IRA and so on, at the various accounts in Waterford and Dublin and so on and so forth. So the idea that the United Kingdom will fall apart as a result of Brexit is part of a sort of a punishment narrative. I hear it in mainland Europe all the time. They're always very disappointed when I say this is not going to happen, because they feel there should be some kind of consequence. But for all the reasons I've given, I don't think it will happen. In fact, all of the tendencies are in the other direction. As for the what is the UK's ordering contribution, nuclear weapons deterrence is important. Hard military, conventional power, which the UK is the main democratic European power. And if NATO falls apart and the American guarantee is withdrawn, then, my friends, the United Kingdom is all you have left in the terms of this side of the Atlantic deterrent. So this is an argument I've made, that Trump actually makes the United Kingdom more important. It weakens the European Union, he weakens the European Union more than he weakens the United Kingdom. So for all these reasons, I think the United Kingdom is still a much bigger actor in this game than many people would accept.
Okay, I would suggest we take 2 more questions. There was a gentleman over here, and then Stefan Gerber next.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, and thank you for coming here. I know it is rude to talk about people's ages, but I'm 67, and growing up in the 60s and 70s, life seemed to be a whole lot better than it is nowadays. Now, the question is, what is the reason for that? Now, it started to fall apart in the 80s under Mrs. Thatcher. Now, can I suggest to you that the answer may be the competition between the forces of conservatism and free marketism in Western Europe and the forces of socialism and collectivism in the East. And it was out of that creative tension that we all had a life that was so good for those of us who were fortunate to grow up then. So my question, one reason why I voted to leave in the referendum was that leaving gives us the opportunity to recreate this new balance again. And what I would really like is to have much closer relations with Belarus and possibly Kazakhstan, possibly Georgia, Ukraine, but complicated. Putin won't be there forever, so we may have a better relationship with Russia, in 20 years' time, as we can think about now. So, as somebody that sort of lives on the right of the political spectrum, do you think that competition could really sort of enrich everybody? I mean, my sense, I went to East Germany in 1979, and what struck me was actually it wasn't a grey, dingy place and everyone was oppressed. It was a really very successful country with world-class industries of well-fed people, and the whole place really did work. And the competition between the Germans, you may disagree, I'm sure, but can we recreate all this and make a much better world? Not just for our own people, but the people of this whole landmass of Eurasia.
Okay. We can ask the professor questions. See, that fits very nicely because Stella is next anyway.
Thank you very much for this masterful overview on European history. So I have a historical question. We know that the doctrine of the balance of power evolved in the very first years of the 18th century. So the balance of power, the principle defining or governing the British position in European politics. But could you trace a moment could you pinpoint when a doctrine really emerged about the British balance between overseas interests and European interests? So, or was it a question that came into its own only after the Second World War? Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you for your question. I won't sort of engage too much in it because I don't share some of your presuppositions in the sense that I too visited the GDR during its existence, but I have a very different view of it. But I guess, you know, that's people different. But to answer your question, which is really about, yes, so it's the question of the relationship between the European balance of power and the overseas balance and how these two interlink, which is obviously a hugely critical question for the 18th and early 19th century, which I know you study very closely, and of course remains important even until the present day and underpins some of these debates. I think that's the drift of your question about global Britain, for instance. And my answer to that would be that the overseas balance, generally speaking, was understood as being subordinate to the European balance. Why did one engage overseas? You went overseas to stop other people doing so, like Spaniards. You went to gain resources which you could parlay into the European theatre, and at the same time, you engaged in continental intervention to prevent the emergence of a hegemon who could build a large navy. So the Duke of Newcastle in the 18th century, just one example, says we must support all these smaller German princes because if we don't, the French will be able to release all these resources and we'll build a whopping big navy and attack us overseas. So these two impulses, these two strategies are interlinked, but ultimately it was European security which was the most important. And of course, in the First and Second World War, that strategy paid off. In the First World War, hundreds of thousands of empire men come from Australia, South Africa, Canada, and so on. Not just to fight in Mesopotamia or in Africa, but actually on the Western Front, in addition to Indians and others and so on and so forth. And in the Second World War, a similar phenomenon. I mentioned the Canadians at D-Day earlier on. After the Second World War, there's a very clear decision in this country to cast off the empire as such for European reasons. It's become an embarrassment to focus back, west of Suez, and to have a European focus. And I think that was the right decision, because in the end, the European context is the critical one. And if I have a criticism of, I have many criticisms, of the current government, it's the idea, I think that what global Britain misunderstands is that after Brexit, mainland Europe is going to become even more important. It's now the near abroad. They're now, precisely this question, how do you now stand? And in the same way, by the way, for mainland Europe, Britain is going to be the most important issue, much, much more important than Russia. And Russia is a disaster zone, economically corrupt, criminal, and so on. Less than half the economy of Britain. Britain is economically strong, dynamic population, and so on. It could be a positive model. That's why so many people here come from other parts of Europe. That's the thing that's really worrying them. So from both ends of the spectrum, for both sides, this will be the most important relationship in a way one will have, politically, even if not economically. And so my hope is that in terms of this balance of power policy, that the UK government recognises the importance of Europe and doesn't fall back into this idea that it should try to split the Europeans. The argument I would make is, even though united Europe can be a nuisance from their point of view, a disunited Europe is an even greater nuisance. Because what the UK has at the moment is a Europe which is united in all the things that are a nuisance, like the Irish border, the economy, and so on, and disunited in the areas where it would be quite useful if they were united, like on defence, Whereas if you had a united Europe, the way I've described it, that would be a much better partner for the United Kingdom, and that would then be the end of the balance of power policy. Just in the same way, after the creation of the United States, or at least after 1812, or at least from 1840s onwards, the UK gave up its balance of power policy in North America and just accepted that, you know, the United States was there to stay.
Okay.
So that's a long answer, but I hope it's
We do one last round of gentlemen waiting a long time over there, and then you want another second one, and then we close it down. There's opportunity to speak to Brendan after the lecture when you buy his book for signature and you get an extra question. Please.
Hello. So this is just assuming that the Union of Europe, as you had stated it earlier, does not happen as smoothly as planned.
Sorry, can you say that again?
This is assuming that the Union of Europe doesn't go as planned, it's not smooth, and it does not become one cohesive unit.
Mm-hmm.
And also that the UK Brexit does not make many, I mean, that the Brexit does not have a lot of profitable arrangements which go in the favor of the United Kingdom. Upon what the gentleman said earlier, and if, say, the NATO weakens over time because of whatever, wouldn't it make sense from at least a security point of view, not an economic point of view, to ally with the Eastern Bloc?
Okay. And last question, the gentleman over there. Microphone is coming.
It seems to me that you're very optimistic about the way in which Britain shed her responsibilities for the colonies after World War II. It wasn't just a benign decision. It was forced upon it by the actions of independence groups around the world. The first state which really challenged it was Ireland, which you should know.
Yes, correct. And of course, these challenges have been many over hundreds of years. So a clear decision was taken not to drown particular movements in, I don't know, Cyprus or Africa, crush them basically through military force. And that was it was a fairly conscious decision. Obviously, there's a push, no question, but it's conceived of within a larger strategy of refocusing on Europe. I mean, I describe it in the book. I'm not denying that there is this, this push factor, but what I'm saying is the reason why they stopped trying to suppress it is in the larger strategic context. Sir, with your question, when you say the Eastern Bloc, do you mean now Poland and...
No, I don't mean Poland, I mean Russia.
Okay, so I feared you might think that. And I understand where you're coming from. I completely understand. So at the moment, the idea that the United Kingdom would have a rapprochement with Russia is almost unthinkable. And when you have, bear in mind the Skripal affair, the earlier murder in London, the Magnitsky, everything points, for a very good reason, for a long-term enmity with Russia. And the United Kingdom has been much, much more robust in facing down the Russians, belatedly, but more robust than, say, the Germans, where Putin simply killed somebody in the Tiergarten quite recently, and there wasn't a peep out of the Germans. How then could you come, as you're implying, to this better relationship? Well, you could, I'm afraid, if the separation between the UK and the European Union is a bloody one. You could create circumstances where UK-Russian rapprochement would not be unthinkable. And the analogy I always draw is, if you'd said to somebody in 1932 that within 10 years, Britain and Soviet Russia would be allied against, the power that controlled most of the European mainland, that would have been considered absurd. But mainland Europe, for various reasons, contrived to organize itself in such a way as to make such an alliance conceivable. So I'm not saying this is not, the European Union is not the Soviet Union and so on, I'm not showing my hand, but my point is simply geopolitical, that the worse the relationship between mainland Europe and this country, the more likely to happen what you described. I completely agree. For me, that would not be a desirable outcome. And I think, more than anything, an impulse to get this relationship sorted on the basis that I've described. And I think I've probably taxed the patience of the audience.
Well, I like it, but I think we bring it to a close. I think we did well in the sense that our dialogue is much better than the dialogue on the official level between politicians and reasoners. That in any case weren't very helpful. And I think we can all agree that probably to keep on this dialogue for historical reasons alone is very important. And yeah, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Brendan, for this excellent lecture.